This is for you new people. I only have one rule. Everyone fights, no one quits. If you don't do your job, I'll shoot you. You get me?
We get you, sir!
Welcome to the Roughnecks.
Ratcats, Roughnecks!
At ease, listen up. Got a new Sky Marshal and a new battle plan.
Welcome to the Imaginaries.
Hello and welcome to The Imaginaries, a podcast where we discuss imaginary things in literature, film, and a variety of other things. I'm here with Tony.
Hello.
And my name is Kendra, and we are going to discuss a topic very near and dear to Tony's heart today.
Oh, I wouldn't go that far, but I do enjoy it.
Which is to say, we are going to discuss both the book and film adaptation of Robert Heinlein's Starship Troopers. So starting us off, Tony, I thought we could maybe talk a little bit about what happens in the book and the movie, especially since they are rather different from each other. Would you like to tackle the movie for me?
I would, yes. So the movie Starship Troopers, which came out in 1997.
Yeah.
So we follow Johnny Rico, who is a Argentinian, I want to say. He's definitely... Where's Buenos Aires?
That's Argentina.
Okay, so he's an Argentinian. And he has a potentially bright future in front of him, and then he enlists in the future army of the planet Earth and goes off to fight bugs, and we have a couple of tangential characters in there. Or rather, I should say, we have a couple of supporting characters in there that the movie also follows. His high school girlfriend who becomes a pilot for the Navy, and his high school best friend who becomes Nazi intelligence officer for the Navy. And we learn more about the war with the bugs. We have some interpersonal things. This movie is large. This movie is a blimp of a movie. And that's one of the reasons why I like it so much. I don't want to get too much into why just yet, but as far as 30-second summary, that's where we are.
Okay, and
how about the book?
Well, the book, and I mean, I know that you've read it too, right?
A long time ago. I mean, in high school, and I put it down. I forget which came first. I either saw the movie and wanted to read the book, or read the book and then realized there was a movie. Either way, they didn't mesh, which... Of course, you've already said.
Yeah, they really don't at all. Like, at all.
Not even a little. But I remember, no matter which one came first, I disliked the book then, and I dislike the book now.
So I'm curious if you can ever track down the answer to this question of sequencing, because if you really hated the book, why did you see the movie?
That's an excellent question. That makes me think that I did see the movie first. But anyway, neither here nor there. Tell us about the book. Okay,
so in the book, we have Johnny Rico. I don't quite know how to pronounce his name because I can't track it down. He only says it once or twice, and then it's lost in the general shuffle of the book. And, you know, you talk about the movie being a blimp of a movie, and I really feel that's true of the book, too. It drops you in the middle of the action, like it literally drops you. You're on a drop with these troopers who are being airdropped into their fighting location, and they're decimated as soon as they hit the ground. So the opening scene of the book is everyone dying, which does mesh up with the movie to an extent. It's not the same characters dying, and it's not really the same situation, but, you know, there's a connection there. And then the book jumps in time, and it goes backwards to his training. And essentially it runs through the entire process of training one of these Starship Troopers, here typified and embodied in Johnny. And then it follows him through the progress of one branch of this interstellar war they're having with primarily the bugs, and secondarily with the aliens that are, I believe, called the Skinnies. And they're like your standard gray Martian alien sort of thing, UFO alien. And so it's not a glamour book, but there's certainly a lot of talk about the technicalities of killing people, which is something you do see in war glamour books. And I see a lot of parallels between this and other books of the era, fiction and nonfiction. So I guess you could just say it's the story of one trooper, and it follows him through his experience being a trooper and his interactions with various branches of the military. It's really heavy on the history, and it's really heavy on the technical aspects of like what weapons they use and how they use them and the strategies they employ. There's not a lot of emotional heart to it, but there's a lot of killing. So that sometimes strikes a nerve for me. So that's the 1-minute summary of the book. So let's talk a little bit about why I was supposed to read and watch this. You're the one who recommended it very strongly. Why was that?
So I did... My recommendation for Starship Troopers is always for the movie and never for the book.
But I don't know. I think it is valuable to read the book and watch the movie. I did them concurrently. I was partway through the book when I watched the movie, and then I finished the book. Which is kind of half-assing it, I know, but the book does, carry you on. Like, it does wrap you up eventually and get you through some interesting plot moments, but...
okay. Caveat. Have not read the book for a long time. Did not enjoy the book when I read it. Have no real desire to go back and reread it again. But I think that you're on point when you say that the book is of a time, that it represents a lot of what else was happening in literature, both fiction, mainstream literary fiction, science fiction, and in the nonfiction. I know you want to talk a little bit about how it's representative of not necessarily just Vietnam-era warfare, but also that sort of, that moment in how we conceptualized what war would look like, both now and for the foreseeable future, which was, a good, probably like 15, 20, 30 years. But the problem is that Starship Troopers, the book, didn't do anything for me in retrospect, as opposed to a lot of the other literature that exists from that time that did similar things.
Sure.
You mentioned in one of we have notes that we refer to as we're doing the podcast. So you mentioned in your notes, Tim O'Brien's The Things They Carried, which is a book that I have liked for a long time in literary fiction. I would compare it to The Forever War by Joe Haldeman, which is another science fictional take on Vietnam-era warfare.
And you've talked about The Forever War before, but I have yet to read
briefly.
it. So it'll now be on my list.
Yeah, so, and I can throw out a couple of other examples, but that's not super important. I mean, the list of examples is not itself important, rather that the list of examples exists is important.
Which is long. To say, it's pretty long,
yes,
apparently.
For sure.
Yeah.
But I don't really feel like I'm missing anything in not reading Starship Troopers, whereas if you don't see the film Starship Troopers, I think the idea that it encapsulates of like bombastic science fiction satire is something that we don't see a lot. And it could have been tonally very similar to like Hitchhiker's Guide, except that movie was very different from Starship Troopers. And I don't want to go too much along that line just yet, but that was essentially where my recommendation was coming from.
You do bring up an interesting point in terms of, I've been thinking a lot about the book in terms of its place in literary history, but I hadn't thought about the movie in terms of its place in terms of satire, science fiction satire, because I think it's pretty pivotal. I mean, Galaxy Quest comes 2 years after this movie, and I'm not certain we could have had something like Galaxy Quest without something like Starship Troopers breaking that ground a little bit.
Yes. And what works so well about Starship Troopers for me is that if you go to see something like Galaxy Quest, obviously you have at the same time it's a satire, it's also an action adventure. And maybe that's more forefronted than the satirical part. You also have things like maybe Idiocracy, which is, again, science fiction satire, but not on the same blockbuster scale necessarily as something like this. But the reason why Starship Troopers succeeded so well is that it's just, on the surface, this mindless nothing action adventure movie that's very loosely based on the Robert Heinlein book. And none of it seems to go together. But you go a couple levels down and it's this very, very intelligent critique of a whole slew of things, which we'll talk about more. But
yeah. Let's get into that a little bit. I'd like to drill down into the movie specifically because...
Yeah.
Okay, so I have mixed feelings about what director Paul Verhoeven did with this movie, and doing a little bit of preliminary research, it's easy to discover just how much he absolutely hates the book, which, fair enough, that's a matter of taste. However, he went so far as to publicly declare that he quit the book partway through, and then just drafted the rest of his film based on his preliminary understanding of the book and what happens there, with the critique that the book was too right-wing, and he wanted to create something less right-wing, which, granted, this is the 90s we're talking about, so that kind of makes sense as a transition from the 50s, actually, when Starship Troopers first came out. But, let's talk about that. What's right-wing about the book that isn't right-wing about the movie, and how do you feel about that? About him breaking from the original text in such a dramatic way and actively hating on the book in the process?
So I'm going to sort of corkscrew into this question.
Yay!
By referencing another movie, Team America: World Police.
Never heard of it.
Oh, all right. Well, maybe this kind of falls flat then, because I'm sort of relying on...
This sounds terrible.
Yeah, so... What it is a movie by the guys who made South Park.
Oh, God.
And I'm not sure if we actually want to include so much of this in there. This might just be useful for you. But it's by the guys who made South Park. And it's puppets. It's stop motion puppets. And it is essentially this movie about this group of American Special Forces agents who are tasked with solving shit all over the world. And it's so offensive and it's so ridiculous. And the reason why, and it made a whole lot of money. And I remember when I was in Prescott and I was friends with folks at the big aeronautical university, which they're, for the most part, all crazy Republican people. Maybe don't include this in the actual broadcast. But all these folks who were definitely right-wing loved this movie, even though this movie was all about skewering them. It was just this pastiche of what America on the global scene was. But they didn't get it. Because it worked on this first level as an action-adventure movie that reified all of these concepts about America as a global hero.
So this is called Team America.
Team America, World Police.
Oh, God.
And the reason I mention this in particular is that the way, how you just asked your question, God, I had such a clever way to actually get this back to your question. But I think the difference is that the book is coming from 50s post-war...
It's actually mid-war. It's right near the beginning of the Vietnam War.
Oh, all right. So, no, I meant post-World War II.
Oh, yeah.
So it's coming from this era of post-World War II, getting into the Vietnam War. Very, on its surface, supportive of this sort of right-wing military expansionism ideal, which the movie is not at all. Even though it looks like it is on the surface, there's all the satirical subtext that says, wink, wink, nod, nod, nudging you with its elbow. This is bullshit. Let's do things like put Neil Patrick Harris in an actual Nazi uniform.
What?
Which the book does not do at all.
Oh,
the
no.
book is 100, I don't want to say 100% genuine, because even though I'm not a big fan of Robert Heinlein, he did some good things, he's important to recognize as a part of the canon, blah, 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 blah. But, he was not trying to critique the military establishment in the same way that the movie is.
No, I agree with that. Although I would say there are moments where that understanding of the complications around being a soldier in the midst of a war that you might or might not agree in. There are moments where that breaks through and really intrudes on the story. And, I was noticing more of them early on in the book before he kind of settles into really fight, because most of the book is training. So during the training, there's a lot of back and forth with his superiors about what it means to be a soldier, what it means to be in a hierarchy where you don't pick what battles you're fighting, and, what it means to take responsibility for the actions of people above or below you who you don't agree with. And those moments are really interesting. However, they're not pulled apart and examined with a critical perspective, because the character Johnny is just kind of like the dumb blockhead who's like in the moment. He just kind of perceives these moments and relates them as they happen, and then he doesn't have an opinion himself most of the time. And that is hard for me to accept, because the author is clearly aware of all of this going on, or else he wouldn't have Johnny's superiors talking about it. However, he just is content to let Johnny continue on. And maybe it's for the sake of plot, and maybe it isn't. Maybe he just needs him to get to the next interesting thing that needs to happen in training, and maybe he just doesn't care enough. It just feels uneven. It's very uneven. It's not like the movie, which sustains that level of self-awareness. In part, the momentum is sustained by these really intrusive little propaganda films that keep cropping up. And I don't know if you have an opinion about them or want to get to them yet, but I want to talk about those.
Yeah, let's definitely talk about the use of the propaganda films in the movie's structure. I do want to say two things before we go on, though. Sure. First thing is I made sort of derogatory reference to the canon just a couple of minutes ago. And I want to mention that because I think it's important to recognize that there is not the canon or a canon, but rather many canons. When I say I don't particularly like Heinlein, what I mean is that he's not part of my personal canon as far as what makes my experience in science fiction and fantasy. Someone like Octavia Butler is much more important than Robert Heinlein, even though obviously they're not contemporaries, they're not writing about the same things necessarily, but as far as what my canon is, it's probably not your canon as a listener, or Kendra's canon as my co-podcaster. So I don't want to, and I recognize that, you're probably, if you're listening to this, you're like, oh, why does this matter? But I think it's important for us to establish where we're coming from when we're talking about some of these things, because if you're someone who really likes Golden Age science fiction and you listen to this podcast because you're like, finally, they're getting to something I know, and then we diss on Heinlein, you stop listening to us, which is fine. That's your choice. But I think it is important to recognize both that canons are not set, and that they can constantly be reassessed and rejiggered and redrafted, and that they vary from person to person, and there is no such thing as a single canon.
Oh, sure. And I don't think we can excise Heinlein from the canon even if we wanted to, simply because he's published so many books that have become, I guess, foundational science fiction to so many readers. Even if we don't like him, we have to admit that he's had a profound influence on the genre. And yes. I actually don't dislike Heinlein. I don't think he's, I think he falls short on several fronts, but he does create a platform for further discussion that's probably pretty important. And he does create the foundation for something like a terribly left-wing adaptation. I mean, and I say terribly, but I really kind of love it too, in the film adaptation. And so, without the book, we wouldn't have had the commentary that we had from Paul Verhoeven he wouldn't have
Yes.
had as much to push against. And I think
Yes.
that's important too. When we look at Golden Age science fiction and any other science fiction, it's not all about what we like and dislike. It's about what we push against and what we find enriching for ourselves as readers and writers. Both of us who are podcasting here are authors. And so we look at things not just as readers, but as like fodder for our own work. So that's important to note as well.
I agree. And that's particularly important to note, I think, because a movie that shares the title with this book, both of these works are called Starship Troopers, is obviously going to have more cultural access because it's obviously compared to and, pushed up against the Heinlein book. Mm-hmm. If it was just called, like, I don't know, Murder Thugs in Space.
No, it would be Bugs. It would just be bugs.
Yes, sorry. If it was called Murdering Bugs in Space. Oh no, if it was just called Bugs. There we go. I like that. Then obviously it wouldn't have the same thing. Like, it would be fun and it would be, over the top, and potentially it would have made a lot of money and it would have been successful, but it wouldn't have accessed the same audience and, really pushed them up against what the original book was doing and this entire canon of work in the same way.
Yeah, and I mean, there's a real line of grit underneath the surface of the film that I think it was catching me off guard the whole time I was watching. I was like, I can't relax. Oh my god, here we go. Okay. I mean, and I think part of the reason why I was caught off guard is because everyone is so damn pretty in the film adaptation. It feels like an infomercial, the entire thing, except the infomercial is staring you in the eye and kind of, I don't know, thinking about murdering something the whole time.
Yep.
And okay.
100%.
and
Speaking of, before we go on to, because I do want to talk about the film and what's going on structurally.
Yeah.
But before we go on, I do want to mention with respect to who read this book and who didn't read this book. I remember reading a while ago, and I forgot to look up the source, but that James Cameron, when he was prepping the cast for Aliens, actually required that they read they read Heinlein's Starship Troopers in preparation for that.
James Cameron's Avatar or Aliens?
No, Aliens.
Oh, but it makes sense for Avatar too, doesn't it?
It does. It's difficult for me to say anything nice about Avatar, but it does.
Okay, so I've been looking this up, and actually Wikipedia has a whole section on the influence of Starship Troopers on Aliens. So for those of our listeners who are curious, you can find that just by Googling Starship Troopers, James Cameron.
Excellent. So in terms of, what it does, I think I remember reading, it might have been the same source or a different source, but that when the movie Starship Troopers was in the works, the response from the studio or the production company or someone was, well, hadn't that already been made and wasn't it called Aliens? So it's interesting that sort of like, because I really like Aliens, I think it's very well done. I'm glad that it's not a straight up adaptation of Starship Troopers, but I think as far as what it was doing in more or less the same vein, but updated and, made in such a way that made sense for the time in which that movie was made, it does share a lot of the same DNA as the book in the way that the movie Starship Troopers does not, or in the way that the movie Starship Troopers takes a look at and then decides it's gonna kick.
Yeah, and actually, we've talked about Aliens on the podcast before, and it's allusions to the Vietnam War, and while I think that plot-wise you couldn't find two more distinctly different pieces of work, I can definitely see how the same themes of the book, as opposed to the movie adaptation, which is really goofy, Aliens takes a much more serious look at what's wrong about Starship Troopers as well as what's right, and I think that creates a much more complicated, interesting take than you might see in a straight-up serious adaptation of this book, which, by the way, I hope never gets made.
I agree, but I have a feeling that somewhere down the line, and it may be a remake of the movie, it may be a readaptation of the book, but
it's just gonna be like Independence Day all over again.
Oh Lord,
it's just gonna be, because the first Independence Day was so good, it was so unique and fresh, and goofy. And I mean, have you been to see the latest reboot of Independence Day?
I will not see that movie.
I will, because I sometimes love to torture myself, but at the same time, yeah, all the reviews and advanced screenings and everything was just coming back like, this is another reboot that takes itself far too seriously, like Jurassic World. You know, it was all so serious.
Which I hated, by the way, and we can podcast about that later, but
we will.
Really hated Jurassic World.
Whenever we hate something, we'll podcast about it. Believe me. So that'll happen. But back to Starship Troopers. Okay, let's talk about the propaganda now.
Let's do.
So, first off, for our listeners who haven't seen the film, it's worth noting that there's a series of short propaganda films that crop up periodically throughout the film, and they are introduced by kind of the same placards or whatever you call it, the same intro graphics as you might see in an infomercial. So it really has this aggressive, intrusive feel every time one of these short films starts. And it turns out that each one of these films was inspired, some of them shot for shot, on Frank Capra's infamous Why We Fight series of short propaganda films, which was commissioned by the United States government to run on American, broadcast television and kind of brainwash America's teenagers and young men into seeing the war as something noble and worth, signing up for. And there's also influences straight up drawn from Leni Riefenstahl's Triumph des Willens, Triumph of the Will, which was a Nazi propaganda film. Very, very famous. So when you see something like this propaganda film, whether or not you're familiar with the original material, it feels very, how would you say it, Tony?
Convincing. Aggressively so.
Yes. And so when you first saw the film, were you kind of caught off guard by those, or did you just love them to bits like you loved the rest of the film?
It's hard to remember. Actually, I don't remember my first viewing of this movie, but I do remember a subsequent viewing, which was in high school, which was with a friend from high school who I am no longer friends with. I haven't talked with her for years and years, but she had never read the book or seen the movie, but she was very into, we were anti-establishment high school kids, and I was like, oh my god, you have to see this movie because it seems like it's just this dumb schlock, and instead it's this really clever, I don't know how I put it back then, but I remember that viewing, so we'll say that I was, 16, 17. But what I remember from that is that I did think that they were very clever, that we were getting this sort of first person, obviously not in the same way that you would find it in a book, but this sort of tight view of Johnny Rico with sometimes asides to his friends. And it could have been, a relatively straightforward story in that way. But instead of that, we get this peppering of these moments, these propaganda film moments, and it feels less like, it's definitely world building, but it feels less like we're learning about the world of this film and more like we're constructing the world of this film. Like we as viewers are trying to be turned towards whatever these films are trying to get us to believe in, which makes perfect sense if they're drawn, or I should say, it makes perfect sense because they're drawn from actual propaganda films, which are meant to, have its viewers leave having seen it and do something or feel something or think something. Yeah,
actually, I don't know what this might say about Verhoeven's intent to integrate sort of gaming into the movie, but there are several of the propaganda films which are actually, you're looking at the console of a screen where you can select options, and the film goes so far as to select the options for you, but it gives you the implication that you are the one choosing the sequence of, commands that you're giving the console. And so then you sort of flick between channels, so to speak, using your console. And of course, the audience doesn't have any actual control over this because this is filmed in that sequence by Verhoeven, but it gives the illusion of gaming or of selecting your choice of television. I just thought that was really interesting because it's not just a straight up propaganda film for some of these little intrusive moments. Some of them are a lot more, I don't know how to put it.
It gives it an immersive quality.
Yeah.
Like, as a viewer, it gives you agency at the same time that it's implicitly taking agency away, because theoretically you're controlling it. You're clicking on the thing, you're continuing to skip channels and watch more of these and know more. The thing that it shows after each of these propaganda pieces is, would you like to know more?
Yeah.
So theoretically, you do want to know more, and you're continuing to know more. But at the same time that you sort of accept that you're a part of this world and are actively participating in it and constructing it, it's taking that away because you are being controlled by these propaganda films. You're being told what to think. You're being told, that you can watch public executions and people and kids stepping on bugs, and that you too can join the mobile infantry.
Oh my God.
So it's this really interesting thing, or it's this really interesting phenomenon that I don't know that I've seen duplicated since, that's both fictionalizing propaganda really effectively, but also inviting the reader to take part not only as someone who's viewing the propaganda, but can be willfully swayed by the propaganda simply by watching this fictionalized version of it.
Oh yeah, and I mean, spoiler alert, but you kind of end on one of these propaganda films, which includes the characters that you've been following throughout the film, and they are portrayed as heroes, in a sense, like the next generation of the mobile infantry and the Navy, Starship Navy? I don't know what they call it.
I forget.
Yeah, and Navy intelligence, I believe. It's just very interesting to see yourself come full circle. And if you haven't bought in to the propaganda by then suddenly you're faced with these characters which you probably have bought into following at that point, becoming the subject of the propaganda. And it feels very neat and self-contained and frightening in a way at the end that it doesn't necessarily feel throughout. Because throughout you can be like, oh, this is just the world building. This isn't them. But then at the end, the characters that have become your centerpiece and your emotional access to the film are the propaganda. And I find that really interesting.
Mm-hmm. Right, because you don't see them in any of the propaganda prior to that, with the exception of Neil Patrick Harris's character, who you see, I think, once when they feed the cow to the bug or something like that.
Oh, yeah, something along there. Somewhere in the middle.
But otherwise, it's all minor roles. You don't have any of the major cast in these propaganda films. Yeah,
and I would even point out that he's always a figure who you're not supposed to fully trust or understand. And seeing Neil Patrick Harris play a cold-blooded, sort of CIA-ish operative is very interesting. And he's like 15 in this movie. It's terrifying.
He was very young. I don't think he was 15, but he was definitely like 20s, I want to say.
Yeah, he's gotten pretty good looking as he got older, I have to say. I like him a few miles on him. But moving back to the propaganda, I mean, what do you think that propaganda like this does for the film that perhaps gives it a leg up over the book or over other films that aren't as self-aware?
I think in large part the self-awareness of the movie and the satire that seems so below the surface but definitely foregrounded comes from the interspersion of these propaganda films. That if we just had this as a straight-up narrative, we follow Johnny Rico and a couple of his friends as they, train and then go kill bugs and get killed by bugs, etc., it would be much harder to do something with that. That's essentially what the book is doing, and even though if we remove the propaganda, the movie would still be a poor adaptation of the book, it would have been a poor adaptation of the book. Whereas with the propaganda, it's an entirely different piece of work. And that's why
there are a couple other things that make it different though, right? Like the female characters get a lot more screen time, there's a hint of diversity in the cast that isn't in the book. So I think that there are interesting moves that Verhoeven makes, which might be legacies or sort of remnants of what he was working on before he merged his script with that from, being informed by the book. Because I believe the way this movie came about is he was kind of drafting a screenplay, and then he heard that it was too close to Starship Troopers. So then they went and bought the rights to Starship Troopers, and then he read the book and didn't like it. And so then he took the names and some of the plot elements, but left most of it behind. If I'm understanding that correctly, that's kind of what I gleaned from the interwebs. So I think that there's actually quite a lot that he does that's different. And I really appreciate, as a woman, seeing women on the screen being active, being agents of their own future. And I think that the girlfriend's character arc is more interesting because she begins to choose what she wants. And the film doesn't necessarily bring that back to now that her ex-boyfriend is a major hero, that she wants him. Like, I think that that's kind of a complicated and a nice move, in that she doesn't do the typical full circle where she appreciates the qualities that she hadn't appreciated in him before. Yeah. That's nice.
Interesting.
And they're all sexually active, which is not something that you see in the book.
No, but which is something that you see in a novel like The Forever War, which, again, is more or less contemporaneous with the book Starship Troopers. Certainly, subject matter-wise, tonally, it is similar. But all of those folks in that book are fucking all the time. Like, there's just so much sex in that book.
In the Forever War?
In The Forever War. And it's presented very, sort of by the by. Like, yeah, you have a lot of folks who are in this infantry division. There are men, there are women, there are folks of all different sexes and genders and sexual orientations. And you have them doing a lot of really active things all the time, and they're gonna need to have sex. Like, that's just a basic biological need that they have. So, yes, we, as we will support this. The army will support this, or whatever it was. And I'd have to go back and look and see and read The Forever War again. But I do remember that there was a lot of sex, and it was very clear that was going on.
Yeah, and I would say that the book mentions sex very occasionally. Like, it mentions that folks might go off and enjoy some interactions with women. In fact, there's a lot of comments on, like, how he appreciates seeing women. Like, he uses that particular expression. I appreciated seeing them. And I think it comes from, but in the book it comes from, he's really starved of female contact. And this is, of course, coming from a time when sexual diversity and gender diversity was not remotely acknowledged in the military. And so, this is a very sexually binary book, in that you have men and you have women, and the men all want the women all the time. And they really miss being around women. So when they see, because the Navy allows for some women staff, when they get to interact with them, it's kind of this really hilarious atmosphere of, ooh, we get to go forward of, deck 34 or whatever it is, so we can actually see the women on this ship. Oh my goodness. It's kind of funny.
Whereas in the film, we get definitely, there's, a lot of fucking that happens. There's a lot of romance, but there's also the glorious shower scene, which, as a young person seeing this movie and having not yet discovered internet porn, that shower scene was sort of the best thing.
Oh my God. I did not know this.
in a lot of movies, that I saw that would sort of like maybe do a little bit of nudity, it's always objectifying the women, like in movies like that. Or you might see the big burly hero guy like stripped down to his shirt or something like that. But in the shower scene where you basically get everyone showering together, and it's not sexualized exactly.
No, it's really not. That's why I'm surprised.
You do get a slap on Casper Van Dien's ass, which that was possibly the most exciting sexual awakening that could have happened for many young women and gay men, I'm sure, who saw this movie.
Oh my God. Okay.
But I just wanted to mention that.
Thank you. As an asexual who's not turned on by this film whatsoever, thank you. No, I think it's worth noting though. Like I'm really hypersensitive to when bodies are being sexualized and unnecessarily so. And I don't feel that the sexuality on display in Starship Troopers, the film, is at all gratuitous. This shower scene doesn't feel gratuitous, and in part I think it might be because the actors are fairly at ease in there. Like I don't feel like it was an unusual thing for them to film, and part of that may have come from the fact that they had Verhoeven and whoever else was on set that day. They had to be naked as well. That was the cast's condition for filming that scene nude. And so everyone was in the same boat. It wasn't a case of, a clothed man with an objective lens, pointing it at these actors. So I appreciate that. And I also appreciate that, that the only other sex scene that's really shown, you don't get like heaving bosoms and, slick abs or, whatever. It's like kind of gritty and it's, under a sleeping bag and they're interrupted and it feels a lot more like what might actually happen in an active military camp. So I think in terms of sex it didn't do too bad by itself, but I also feel like it really wasn't the point. It was just kind of background noise in establishing the emotional connections between the different characters, which in the book you don't have. You have one central character and then his superiors who cycle in and out depending on, where he's deployed. So, I think that the film had some work to do in terms of setting up some tension to help propel the story along and make you interested in how the characters ended up sorting themselves out. So that helps. The sex helps with that. and let's talk too about is this both of these texts are old by current standards.
They are.
The film is almost 20 years old and the book was published in the 50s. So you're looking at least 60 years of mileage on that. So, what's useful for us today? And do you think people should still read/watch the film? Or are there substitutes that do the same work?
That's a great question. And I think maybe that's the question we want to end on since we're in the last few minutes of the podcast now. But thinking about why Starship Troopers, either version, matters today, if it should matter today, if there is need for it to still be a part of the cultural conversation in science fiction and fantasy, as well as larger conversations regarding what's going on today, what has been going on, and what's going to go on in the future. And I think for the movie, the answer is yes. Because I can't think of any film, and caveat here, I am not a huge movie watcher, so there could be other movies that do similar things or are tonally similar but have different approaches or whatever. But as far as what I know, there isn't a lot that really duplicates the work that Starship Troopers did. I will say that my statement that Starship Troopers, the movie, is still important today is sort of contingent on it being closely read. As far as action movies go, there are so many dumb science fiction action movies out there that we don't really need to remember another one. But part of the staying power of Starship Troopers is that it works on so many levels and it can survive close readings in the ways that a lot of blockbuster action movies can. And in fact, it's actually really, really rich when you consider those close readings. So I don't want Starship Troopers to be around for the sake of folks saying that it was a big, dumb, stupid adaptation of a Heinlein book. That can go away. I want folks to remember it as a clever way in which propaganda and liberal critiques of the military-industrial complex were leveled via a blockbuster action-adventure movie, and done well.
Very, very well. And, in a certain sense, I have similar things to say about the book. It's a polished book. It reads very smoothly. The prose is clean. Heinlein clearly has a good grasp of military strategy. In a lot of ways, it's still interesting. I don't think it's as self-aware as the movie is, and I don't think it benefits from having at least one second opinion also present in the text, which is clearly what's happening with Verhoeven in his film. However, I think that there is, as we talked about earlier, there's virtue in going back and looking at the golden age science fiction and looking at everything that's happened since then, the mainstays of science fiction from the 1800s to today, and seeing what they still have to say about their time, if not our time. And since we still live in a generation where we have active military fighting units on the ground in foreign countries waging war, I think it is important for us to diversify our understanding of what that could look or feel like, the emotional crux of it at least, because we are, for better or worse, we're a generation at war. We might personally not be at war, but that's kind of the point of Starship Troopers too, in that in the book, you're training a very, very small subset. They talk about attrition rates a lot. A very, very small subset of the people who go into the mobile infantry actually make it through training. So that specialized group of soldiers is fighting for the rest of, the people on planet Earth in Argentina or other places. And that's a lot like what our military is today. Caveat here, my sister paid her way through college by joining the Air Force and met her husband at field training, and he's still in. So there is a part of me that's trying to understand that decision and trying to understand why we're still fighting wars and why, what my personal connection to that should be. And I think that that's where the value of Starship Troopers is to me, both book and film, really. What is our place in war, and how do we fight wars as a society? I just think it's really still worth checking in on. Whether or not, you think the movie's well acted or not, whether or not you think the book is as self-aware as it should be, they still have nuggets worth, and who am I to critique someone else's taste in war literature? Of course I prefer Tim O'Brien. I love Tim O'Brien. But of course I also have a preference for nonfiction, and I think the stakes are higher there. But that's personal preference. So take that or leave it.
And I think that's actually a really wonderful note to end on, this continuing conversation about war and what Starship Troopers, as both a book and a movie, can add to that conversation, and their continued importance contributing to that conversation. Mm-hmm. And I think that's where we should bid you farewell.
So, dear listeners, thank you so much for listening to us talk about this book and this movie today. If you're interested in finding out more about us, please find us at our blog, which is www.imaginaries.us. Twitter will be soon to follow, we promise. I know we promised that before, but we really, really promise. And we hope that you're having a fantastic holiday season.
Goodbye.